Moscow, where President Putin's been telling a joint special session of the Russian Parliament, or Duma, about plans for Crimea to become part of Russia again after the weekend's referendum there. He told politicians in Moscow, in people's hearts and in their minds, Crimea has always been and remains part of Russia.
On the 17th of March,
Он прошел в полном соответствии с демократическими процедурами и международно-правовыми нормами. В голосовании приняло участие более 82% избирателей. Более 96% высказалось за воссоединение. Цифры предельно убедительны.
President Putin speaking a short time ago. Let's go over to Richard Galpin, who's live for us in Moscow. Richard, President Putin wrapping up only a few minutes ago, absolutely adamant that what has happened in Crimea is the beginning of putting right a historical wrong.
Yes, absolutely. He went right back over the history, talking about how close the relationship, for hundreds and hundreds of years has been between Russia, Ukraine, and obviously specifically Crimea, and saying that when Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader in 1954, decided to hand Crimea to Ukraine, it was that time it was part of Russia, he was saying that this was wrong, it had violated constitutional norms and basically was a mistake and was unacceptable. So essentially he's saying that this is, as you say, is righting a wrong, despite what he says has been the intervention of Western countries in Ukraine. And he was stressing that essentially that Russia, having effectively now got Crimea, does not want to divide Ukraine. He seems to be sort of backing off over those concerns that Russian military forces might intervene further, although he did say that there is effectively chaos in Ukraine. There's no government, that radicals have taken over, that there are these neo-Nazi elements who've been repressing the ethnic Russians. So they're still very concerned about the situation. One other thing also, he was really highlighting, I think, what has been one of their big concerns, which is the prospect that the government in Kiev now would potentially join NATO. And he made a lot of references to that, talking about how could we possibly countenance the possibility of there being NATO bases in a place like Ukraine, and specifically in the Crimea, where Russia's Black Sea Fleet is based, that would be an absolute threat to Russia, in fact, to the whole of Russia's southern borders.
Richard, what exactly is the process of Crimea becoming part of Russia? What happens now?
Well, as far as we understand it, Mr. Putin has now signed that treaty. We just had the ceremony literally just a few minutes ago. So that has happened. My understanding is that it now has to go to the countries, to Russia's constitutional court, which is actually in St. Petersburg. They have to examine it, presumably make sure that it actually falls within the Russian constitution. Assuming that the court is happy about that, then the treaty will then come back to the Russian parliament, so both the lower and upper houses, and they will then ratify it. And actually, Mr. Putin said in his speech, I trust you trust that you in the parliament will fully support this, which of course, absolutely they will. And certainly MPs here have been talking about the possibility that this whole process now will be done by the end of this week.
Richard, just as you are speaking, I'm seeing news that Vladimir Putin, the Crimean Prime Minister Aksinov and the Speaker Konstantinov have signed an agreement. They were doing that a few moments ago, and these are the pictures that we've got of that taking place. So much as expected.
Yes, absolutely. This has been billed, really. We weren't sure whether it was definitely going to happen, but it certainly seemed this was the scenario which was being prepared. The fact that we're going to have this big meeting of all the MPs inside the Kremlin, and then there's now going to be a rally and a concert essentially in celebration. All of those plans we knew were being made. So basically, yes, as had been expected.
OK, Richard, thanks very much. With Moscow, Richard Galpin there. Let's go over to Crimea. now because we've got Ben Brown there, and Ben has been there for several weeks in the run-up to this referendum on the weekend. We're hoping to speak to Ben at the moment, but we are having a few problems getting in contact with him from the capital, Simferopol. But just to show you again that picture of Vladimir Putin there signing the treaty that we heard of just a few moments ago. If we can show you the pictures, there he is, and that is the Crimean Prime Minister Aksenov, the Speaker Konstantinov, and that relayed on state television after that address to both houses of the Russian Parliament by Vladimir Putin there as he shakes the hands of those fellow signers of that agreement, the Crimean Prime Minister, the Speaker, and Crimea signing up to joining Russia very quickly after that referendum only 2 days ago, very quickly after Vladimir Putin's speech to the Duma over the last hour. But he wrapped up talking just a few minutes ago, and there we saw, as Richard was detailing there, the signing of that agreement for Crimea to become part of Russia once more. But with me here is Dr. Michael Williams, who's Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of London. And Mike Williams, I was just wondering your perspective. This has happened, if you look at it, 48 hours, incredibly quick process. But it seems from Vladimir Putin's speech that for Russians, or many Russians, this has been building up for decades. This is a historical wrong being righted in their point of view.
Well, this is the Russian argument, and it's not a new one. It's one that has roots from the end of the Cold War to the present day, vis-a-vis Eastern Europe and the Russophile in Eastern Europe, and in Crimea in particular. However, the problem is that there's absolutely no legal precedent for this. It's not legal under international law. If the Russian population wanted to, they could return to Russia, but a population cannot vote to actually take their territory and leave. And what this does is it would legally open up a can of worms. So, for example, the Germans could say, well, we want all of East Prussia back, right? The British, who inhabited large parts of the world during the colonial period, could say, well, there are Brits being ethnically oppressed and we should intervene there, right? So there's no legal justification for this. And the way it's been occurred under duress with Russian forces on the ground really sets a dangerous precedent, which is why North America and the European Union are so concerned.
What do you expect to see now from the West as a result of what we've heard in the last hour or so and what we've seen there?
Well, they have two options. One, they can accept de facto the situation and make no real move against the Russians. I doubt that will happen. More likely, we'll see probably an increasing level of sanctions being applied by the North American countries and European countries. To what extent they go remains to be seen. The U.S. president, should he choose, could really try to inflict some serious damage on Moscow. One option, for example, would be releasing the strategic petroleum reserves. The United States could sell 500,000 to 750,000 barrels of oil per day for the next 2 years from the petroleum reserve, and that would depress the value of oil about $10 a barrel, which would reduce 40 billion, roughly 10% of Russia's GDP over the course of a year. So if they wanted to, they could really push forward with some severe sanctions in response to this. However, there's a lot of other linkages related to Afghanistan and Iran that they're going to want to be cautious of.
Also with me is Artyom Lis, editor of the BBC's Russian service, and BBC Ukraine analyst Alexei Solohubenko. And Alexei, first of all, just listening to what Vladimir Putin said about the new Ukrainian government, I mean, he was absolutely uncompromising. He says it's a regime, a takeover, a coup by fascists and nationalists.
Yes, and he said there's no one to talk there, which creates a big problem. If he, as he said then, that we want friendly relations, good relations with Ukraine, how does he achieve that? That is not clear. The other thing that is not clear is that he did make a reference to southeastern Ukraine when he was making these very passionate, very emotional references to Russian history, or at least parts of Russian history. He was talking about the divisions, about the Russian nation being the most divided nation as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Crimea was mentioned in the same line as southeastern Ukraine, and that will certainly worry quite a lot of not just politicians, but people across Ukraine, I guess, and its neighbors as well.
Artyom, what did you make of the language today?
I think he very specifically chose to use language which will appeal very much to his domestic power base, to his domestic electorate. He spoke about post-Soviet nostalgia. He spoke about the West being against Russia and trying to harm Russia. And he also spoke, as Alexei just said, about the divided Russian nation. These are all the themes which are, you know, very powerful in the Russian domestic political agenda. So it's primarily, I think, or certainly to a large extent, those people that he's trying to address, people who he expects will vote for him and will continue supporting him.
Artyom, while you're speaking there, we were just watching the signing of that agreement. Let's go actually to Kiev now, because Chris Morris is there for us, our Europe correspondent. Chris, just tell us the reaction you think will be coming out of Kiev today as a result of what we've been hearing in the last hour or so.
Well, the reaction, in a sense, came in a pre-battle, as they call it in America, from the acting Prime Minister here, Arseniy Yatsenyuk. He gave a televised statement earlier in the day, which he aimed very much at communities in eastern Ukraine, in which he reaffirmed the idea that Russian would remain an official language in places where there is a Russian majority in the country. He said the new government was doing everything it could to ensure that there would be decentralization of power to regional authorities embedded in a new constitution, which is going to be worked on over the next few months. And he also said he didn't feel the time was right for Ukraine to move closer to NATO. So really sort of putting out an appeal, if you like, to communities who may be having second thoughts about their future in Ukraine, that he is determined to create the conditions in which it remains a united country. I think some of what Mr. Putin said in his speech would be seen here as reasonably alarming. I think that alarm would be shared across other former Soviet republics, especially his comment that essentially it sounded to me like he was reserving the right to interfere anywhere where there are large Russian minorities. So that's a cause for concern. On the other hand, he said he wanted to reach out and speak to the people of Ukraine and said, we're not the ones who are going to split your country. Instead, he placed the blame on what he called imposters and radicals here in the new government in Kiev. So a mixed message, perhaps nothing surprising from a Ukrainian perspective, though, in what he said about Crimea itself.
And Chris, how big are worries that this won't stop with Crimea, that there are other parts of Ukraine that may go the same way?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question? Were you talking about eastern Ukraine?
Yes.
I mean, there's still, if I understood your question correctly, with the connection's not ideal, there is still a fear. There's no question about that, about what's going to happen in other parts of the country. No one's admitting it officially, but for now, certainly, Crimea has gone. There's no question about that, even though every official statement is saying that Crimea was, is, and will remain part of Ukraine. That battle seems to have been lost. So now the attention is focused on places in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian Prime Minister, Mr. Yatsenyuk, said this morning that they have information that those who've been causing trouble have been agitators from Russia. He's determined that they won't be able to cause further trouble. And they're saying that anyone who tries to provoke separatism in the east of the country will be liable to arrest and prosecution. So on that score, there's concern, certainly. But practically speaking, not a lot that Ukraine can do. It's called up the National Guard, it's announced a partial mobilization of the armed forces, but it is very, very nervous about the way that Russian troops have been massing just across the border.
Chris, thanks very much. Chris Morris there in Kiev, and thanks for persevering, Chris, despite the glitches on the line. Let's go to Crimea now, to Simferopol, and join Ben Brown. We've been trying to talk to Ben for a few moments now. Ben, good to have you with us. Just tell us, 48 hours or less than 48 hours after this referendum ended, what is the scene there now?
Well, there's some celebrations here in the square behind me. We're in Lenin Square here in Simferopol, the regional capital. They've been waving the Crimean flag, a large Crimean flag, and some Russian flags as well.
We seem to be having a few problems with the connection to Simferopol. Ben, I'm afraid we can't hear you. You've broken up. We will try to come back to you and re-establish that connection. Let's carry on the discussion here in the studio. And you were shaking, well, you were nodding your head in agreement there, Mike Williams, just about the fact that Kiev can't do really very much now at all.
No, there's not much they can do. I think that there won't be an official recognition of the situation, but that doesn't mean that the situation on the ground hasn't changed. And I doubt that they're going to challenge that directly militarily, and the Western countries certainly have no desire to do that. And so I think at the moment it'll just be a situation of wait and see. But the real concern is I think, further annexation of territory. I just came back from Tallinn in Estonia, where I can tell you that there's a very palpable fear in a very small country of about 1.2 million people with about a 30% Russian ethnic minority population who are very concerned that the Russian government will use a pretext like they have in Crimea to annex Estonian territory.
Even though it's part of the European Union.
Even though it's part of the European Union. They don't, and they say, well, we're in NATO, we're in the EU, and so we hope, but we're a little country. Russia could swallow us up as one local. No one would really even notice. So I think there's a lot to be concerned about, because as you heard in the analysis and in the speech, President Putin really laid out a wide claim to intervene wherever he thought that sort of Russians were being oppressed. And as we know from independent observers on the ground, no one has been oppressed in Crimea whatsoever. So this is it's a complete imaginary happening, what's happened there. He used the Kosovo precedent, but Kosovo is completely different. There was a 10-year period where you had ethnic cleansing, you had oppression by the government, you had international processes involving Russia as well as Western countries to try and stop this, and NATO only intervened after a decade. And here we have basically within a few weeks a situation that has been entirely fabricated on one side, uses a pretext to basically annex territory, which we haven't seen since the Second World War.
Alexei, what now? I mean, as Kiev obviously can't do anything militarily or wouldn't want to, is this just one that has to go?
I think certainly people in Kiev, the government, were very disappointed. They don't say it, but they were certainly disappointed by how feeble the sanctions were, the list of people on the sanctions, and whether it's possible to tighten them up. But I think they will be also very, very worried about the President Putin saying that the right of nations to self-determination is important. This is what happened in Crimea. This is what earlier happened in Kosovo. However, territorial integrity didn't cross his mind. He also didn't mention the guarantees that Russia, as a signatory of the memorandum after Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994, together with the United States and together with the United Kingdom, Russia guaranteed territorial integrity of Ukraine. So that is thrown out of the water, and he prefers to talk very, very passionately about the right of nations to self-determination. And again, I think this repetition that Russia is the nation that was humiliated, now it's back, now it's a resurgent force, you have to listen to us because what we are saying is right, what you are saying is wrong, was a very, very strong message to the West. I think it will be interesting to see how they will respond and whether they will back Ukraine more strongly than they did so far through sanctions, through economic pressure, through any other diplomatic pressure that they can choose to select. I think this will be a very, very interesting thing to watch in the next couple of days.
Artyom?
Well, I think I agree with Alexei that battle is virtually lost, the battle for the Crimea. On the wider scale, I do think that the sanctions, as Alexei said, will probably not, or at least the sanctions which we saw on Monday, are not going to affect the Russians that much. The biggest concern is indeed what the relations will be between Russia and the West. He pitted Moscow very, very clearly against the West. He kept referring to the West as people who were supporting the nationalist, as he sees it, government in Kiev. He says it's the people in the West that initiated the breakup of the Soviet Union and all the, as he sees it, suffering which the Russian nation endured because of that. So it's a very clear division here between Moscow and essentially the countries in the West. He's making a bit of a geopolitical U-turn as well, because he did thank the Chinese for their support, which, you know, question how much support was there. But a lot of people, if you look at the reaction, at the sort of, you know, first moments of reaction across Russia, then a lot of people are saying, is this a geopolitical U-turn?
We're going to have to leave this there. Thank you very much, Alexei, Artyom from the BBC, and Professor Mike Williams. Thank you very much to all of you. But let's go over to Kiev, because Maxim Eristavi is a Ukrainian journalist there in Kiev. He's on the line now. And Maxim, just give us your perspective on what we've heard in the last hour or two.
You know, unfortunately, there is nothing new in Putin's speech today, and especially for Ukraine, all that rhetoric about neo-Nazis and, you know, to restore this Russian power and to protect Russian-speaking citizens in Ukraine. It's same old rhetoric we heard before. What is interesting, though, it's that right now it's pretty obvious from Putin's speech that Ukraine is just a big battlefield for him in in this great standoff, Russia versus the West. And right now, it's much bigger for him than to take over Russian-speaking territories.
Is this the end of the battle as far as Crimea is concerned, though? Is this one that Kiev has to just simply put its hands up to?
No, unfortunately, you know, from that really much of anger that we heard in his speech, I think this is just the beginning of big battle for Ukraine, not only for Russian-speaking territories, for eastern and southern provinces, also for government in Kiev, because basically the real talking point for him is not to, you know, fight for Russian-speaking residents of Ukraine, but to overthrow this, how he said, neo-Nazi or radical government in Kiev, because he knows as long as this government stands in Kiev, there is a permanent threat to his regime in Russia.
Okay, Maxim Eristavi, who is a journalist speaking to us live from Kiev. Thank you very much there in Ukraine. Well, you can get lots more on President Putin's speech as well as analysis on Crimea. We've also got a live page where our journalists are updating all the latest news, the tweets, the video that's coming out and reaction. Just go to bbc.com/news and it will update pretty often with all the very latest developments as they happen in this very fast-moving sequence of events. Now, in other news, relatives of Chinese passengers on board the missing Malaysia Airlines